today. Hello, Mello. Welcome.
Thank you.
Before we go through the talk of Mello's talk, we can, of course, go for a shout out to our sponsors. You can, of course, visit them. And big thanks to all of them for helping us set up this this awesome React Day today. Even if it's an online conference, it's still immense help from them to get this up. And of course, a big thanks to all the speakers. Thank you, Mello, because I know that usually people thank the sponsors, but also speakers are extremely important, I guess, for a conference, right? So without further ado, I will let you go through your talk. And for the guys that are watching, please post any question in the chat. I will go through them and pass them on to Mello for him to answer after his talk, and we can go through them all together. So yeah, sorry, Mello, for the long introduction, I guess. So it's all you.
All right. Yeah, no, thank you very much. I'm excited to give this talk. So let's actually get started. Let me actually try to make this full screen again because the bar is showing. Perfect. So yeah, my talk is called Urban Planning and Codebase Architecture, or How Not to End Up with a Wendy's in Your City. And I'm sorry again for this. I'm trying to get my slides ready. All right, okay. So yeah, my talk's Urban Planning and Codebase Architecture, How Not to End Up with a Wendy's in the middle of your city. So like I said, my name is Romello. By day, I'm a senior software engineer at the New York Times, and the team I work on is called UX Foundations. And we really just work to ensure that across all of our different platforms, whether it's our apps or our websites, that we kind of provide a cohesive user experience, and that's like worthy of our journalism. So things like making sure navigation is consistent, and just really ensuring that our user experience is consistent for everybody, regardless of where they're reading the news. We do a lot of great work, and I work with tons of really talented people, and of course we're hiring. So if you would like to learn more, or if any of this interests you, please do not hesitate to take a look and browse our open jobs. But by night, I like to explore the space of computational graphic design. I love the web, and I love creative coding. A lot of the tools that I use are web-based tools like JavaScript and SVGs to kind of explore how we can use computers to do graphic design and kind of explore the connection between creative coding and creativity in general and coding. You can find me on Twitter at MelloGood. And if you want to see some of the things that I've worked on, like my recent projects, Good Graphics at XYZ is a good place to kind of learn more about it. I do a lot of my thinking and research around creative coding there, and it's all on the service of creativity and producing kind of print and digital experiments. So we're going to talk a lot about Washington, D.C., which is the capital of the United States. But before I do that, I want to do a land acknowledgement. Washington, D.C. is located on stolen land. It sits on the ancestral land of the Anacostia, Piscataway, and Pomanuke peoples. And I think it's important that we can't discuss how land is used without acknowledging that in this country, this land was stolen, and that there is a deep and brutal history of this, and we need to create space for that in these spaces when we talk about the future of how land should be used. So my talk kind of has four big takeaways, and I want to present them up front. The first takeaway is that codebases are like cities. The second takeaway is that maps and signs help teams navigate a code base. Third takeaway is that desire paths create fresh ways to navigate a code base. And the fourth period is that common periods create engagement and share ideas. So let's get started. So in 1790, our Congress authorized the creation of Washington, D.C. Through an act They took land from the neighboring states of Maryland and Virginia. And architect Pierre L'Enfant was chosen by George Washington, our first president, to design the city. L'Enfant was French, so a lot of his architectural background and teachings were based in a lot of European ideas. And so when he designed the city, he took a lot of those learnings and updated to match the American values at the time of equality and freedom. So a quote from an article is that the entire city was built around the idea that every citizen was equally important. So the way that kind of translated is that there are tons of parks throughout the city. There you can kind of see every important building from kind of anywhere in the city by leveraging a lot of wide boulevards, so anyone can get around town. And all of the kind of, like I said, important buildings can be seen through these big avenues that cut through the city. These avenues are named after each state, so it kind of makes it easier to also navigate when you're on the grid system because you can kind of find it by the state. But in general, this was a system that he designed and really was based on kind of these lofty ideas. And for the most part, when we look at DC today, you can kind of still see that grid system and that plan came to fruition. You can see the diagonals that cut through the city. You can see our grid system, and you can see that a lot of L'Enfant's original intentions kind of have stood the test of time. And even when we take a look at the city, we can see that like this DC is a gorgeous city. This picture is of kind of the mall and the more government side of it, but even outside of this, there's a deep and like really rich history here. I moved here 5 years ago. Like I've really enjoyed learning about it and learning about all the different people who've lived here and all the different people who've helped shape the city that you kind of don't think about outside of the government. But the city has a really deep history and has really like evolved over time. But you still do end up with things like this. So this is the Wendy's in question. For those who don't know, Wendy's is a fast food restaurant, and this intersection is locally known as Dave Thomas Circle, named after the founder of Wendy's. And it's really the result of those diagonal streets I was talking about before. So the street at the top near the Wendy's sign is Florida Avenue. It's a big avenue that cuts across the city. And then the street on the right side of the Wendy's is New York Avenue. And it's really just a kind of unfortunate confluence of events that this part of the city wasn't updated from L'Enfant's original plans, because you kind of get this this weird roundabout where in the middle of like a very densely populated and densely trafficked area where I've seen people not realize that a roundabout is coming up and drive into oncoming traffic. I've seen them like go over curbs, and locally we all just hate this kind of solution and really wish someone would fix it. And it kind of highlighted a lot of things for me because this was the original plan, and I don't think L'Enfant intended this, but I think that when we look at the lessons from L'Enfant, we can kind of glean a few different things. Like I said, L'Enfant was European and he was French, so a lot of his architecture designs were influenced from his European background and European learnings. So you can kind of see how like a lot of his past learnings and came to influence his future decisions. But also when you kind of look at his plans, you can kind of see that sometimes our like ideal solutions fall out of date, and the way that cities and just our plans come to be used in the future kind of don't match up with kind of what we had in our minds. And then also that our finished products usually differ from our plans, and that our projects will have many maintainers. I like to highlight the last part because it's actually kind of funny that L'Enfant didn't get to see DC get built. He resigned early before the project could be finished, and it had to be handed off and completed by people like Benjamin Banneker, who is a local DC hero. And I think that like you can tie all this back to software development, and because you kind of start to see that building cities and being an urban planner is really similar to kind of working in a code base. And if you start to think about this way, you can kind of see that code bases are in some ways like cities. There's a large number of people constantly moving through them. Each person is trying to reach their own destination. Each group has their own priorities, and both code bases and cities are really designed to optimize this flow. At the New York Times, one of our main repos has like 150 contributors on it. And we have an entire platforms team that not only supports this repo, but a lot of our mission critical repos and makes sure that things like tests and CI/CD is passing, and just ensures that the structure and the way that we are all working in these code bases works for everyone and tries to make it better. And I think it kind of really highlights that software developers are really like urban planners. This is my obligatory meme for my tech talk. A lot of people like to say coding is like building a house, but really I think coding is like designing a city. And I think it's a better metaphor because cities last longer. A house may last maybe a couple of decades, but DC specifically has been around for 200 years. Cities contain more people, and also cities are networked and they're dynamic. And so I think that when we look at the field of urban planning, there's a bunch of things we can take from it. But for the purpose of this talk, I want to talk about 3 concepts that is used in urban planning, in the urban planning field that we can kind of take away and apply to our code bases. The first being maps and signs, the second being desire paths, and the third being public hearings and comment periods. So maps and signs. This is a freeway or highway in Washington, D.C. And on first glance, it looks like a lot. But when you're driving it, it kind of makes sense. You know, everything is laid out because it is a big highway, but also everyone who is on it has their own destination. So you need to kind of guide each and every one of them to their destination. So it's a lot of information, but all that information is in the service of making it easier to navigate the city. And this kind of highlights that maps help people locate specific places. You can't get from point A to point B without knowing where it is. And when you have mapped out your entire city, you kind of know it's easy to find, oh, this place is actually very close, this place is very far, and you can kind of plan your destination. And then when you're on your way, signs help navigate people to their destinations, whether it be if you're walking and there's a sign telling you to turn right, or that the closest metro is a block away or 2 blocks away, or even if you're on like navigating public transportation, lots of signs will navigate you towards your destination and help you get there. And I think that in our code bases, maps and signs can accomplish the same thing. So an example of the maps and signs are files in our folder structure. Files and folder structures can implicitly help developers navigate. A consistent folder system can make the layout clear, and it becomes easy to structure your code because you kind of just intuit it. So at the New York Times, whenever we write React components, they usually kind of follow, the structures usually kind of follow a progression where you write your basic components in a component.js file. So whether it be header.js, footer.js, or just profile.js, it's just a simple file. But as you start to add more logic, we tend to create folders with that same component name. And then we're allowed to add more files to it. So there's an index.js where we kind of keep that same original JavaScript and React logic. There's a stylus.js where we keep our CSS-in-JS solution and all those stylings. And then typically, if the file is big enough, we will kind of abstract out a utils.js to kind of try and keep a lot of the logic used in our JavaScript React components separate and reusable if we need it. And this structure isn't isn't enforced. It's kind of just inferred by people. A lot of people kind of, or especially myself, whenever I create a new component, I just know that this is the way that we all at the company kind of lay out components and like lay out our logic, because it's system and a pattern that we all use. And I think that things like that are important because it kind of creates a implicit understanding of whenever I go to a new code base, if I see a folder, I can know that just find the index.js files. And I kind of already know how to work in any code base and navigate it from this kind of shared understanding that this is how we want to organize things. Another type of maps and signs is documentation, and documentation is actually more explicit, meaning that you can't just infer it. Docs need to be written and they need to be maintained. good documentation guides developers, and good docs help developers find the correct files to work in. I think anyone can kind of know that like documentation is very important. There's whole conferences devoted to it. And I think that within this context, documentation can really help people understand where to put their logic. Um, my favorite example of documentation is the open source project called With Spectrum. It was acquired by GitHub a few years ago, but it's my favorite example because of this folder structure section. So the way that the project is structured is that it was a bunch of microservices on a monorepo. So this folder structure diagram really documented, okay, if you need to work in this service, you go to this folder. If you need to add logic to the front end, you go to this folder. And I think that even though this is a monorepo, that even the smallest code base can really benefit from this because it explicitly tells developers right when they start to work in the code base where to put things. It clearly marks out that, hey, maybe the styles are in this folder, maybe the assets are in this folder, but it really just allows a quick overview so that people don't have to search, and it's very explicit, and it can kind of really take away a lot of the time of like navigating the file tree and understanding and getting your bearings by just documenting it up front. And on the and then the other end of documentation is documentation generation. I think that there are a lot of tools that kind of do this practice called static code analysis that analyzes your code for you and creates docs. And I'm a big fan of these because it automatically creates the maps and diagrams for you. It ensures that your documentation is always up to date because your documentation is based on your code, and as that changes, your docs will update. And it also fulfills the self-documenting code myth because your code kind of in some ways does become self-documenting. You may have to add more structure like a JS doc or something, but it kind of does keep your docs close to your code so that as one is updated, the other can be updated. And as an example, I wanted to highlight XState, which I think is becoming very popular, and state machines in general are becoming very popular in the React community. But I like this practice because there's a lot of tooling around them to, as you write your state machine, to automatically create your documentation, and you can begin to really visualize how a lot of complex state is updated. And I think that's important because no matter what your state management solution is, it has to be easy for new people to understand it, and it has to be easy to understand from a high overview. And I think that tools that allow that, make that easier, are only going to help us in the long run. So the second concept I want to talk about is called desire paths. And the definition of them are, if you've ever been to kind of maybe, I would like to say any park or any place that is heavily trafficked, we've all seen paths that cut across the walkways and kind of look like shortcuts. These are called desire paths. I like to see them as people creating new use cases for the city and people's learning how to use the city in their own way. And it's really multiple people over time just deciding that, okay, instead of taking this long way, I'm just going to take this new route. And it kind of creates a kind of really cool way of taking part in the design of your city and actually saying that like, hey, this wasn't here before, but like this is something that like anyone can use, and this is a way of moving throughout the city that a lot of people find valuable. And no matter how much people try, or urban planners try to maybe patch over those grassy kind of patches, people still will trot over them because they know that that is like the way that they like to navigate through the city, and it kind of creates a bit of freedom in city navigation because sometimes it can be a little systematic, I should say. And so in our code bases, desire paths can be a fresh way to navigate a code base. If we kind of take this paradigm, it can allow engineers to create new paradigms and patterns by making sure that they can navigate the code base in ways that they understand. A lot of moving through a code base is understanding what files exist already and trying to find the right place to put your logic. And at times when we don't know what the right place is, we kind of have an internal understanding of like, well, this feels right to me. And I think that a big barrier to this is the fact that a lot of our code editors, the tree view is actually bad for discoverability. I think tree views kind of facilitate like a one way of navigating a code base where you kind of have to know exactly where you're going and what component you're looking at and drill down that component to kind of understand all of these different files. And it kind of becomes an easy way to hide complexity. I know many times in my career I've looked at a component that looked pretty simple, like header, and inside of it was 15 different components, each with their own subfolders. And I think that while organizationally it's worked and everything was in its own place, that kind of made it hard to kind of navigate within those files. And it also made it hard to understand your dependencies at a glance and really hard to overall understand the code base. So to kind of encourage desire paths in my own personal projects, I started to really lean more on using the search functionality in our text editors and longer file names. And I think it's an opportunity to add more information to our file names. A lot of this comes from the JS convention of adding .test.js to your files. And I really liked it because from a glance, you can kind of see and understand that, oh, that is a test file. And when you extrapolate it, you can kind of see how if we had .redux.js, you can kind of very quickly understand if a component uses Redux, if a component uses any type of library by adding these onto the extension, or adding this extension in between the component name and the end JavaScript extension. It also kind of fixes the control F index.js problem, where a lot of times I will search in a code base index.js and I will just see 40 different index.js's, and it becomes hard to really understand like which one am I looking for and which one is the right one, because when you start to kind of have a system where the end file doesn't match up with the component name, it can be hard to understand it. And I think the biggest benefit is that once we have this understanding of once we have this workflow where people kind of search and kind of find things and discover new ways of getting from file A to file B using search functionality, the engineers can start to build their own mental model and really start to come up with their own navigation paths that aren't really strictly enforced, and we can start to see new ways of getting, bridging logic together, and maybe files that normally you wouldn't think work together can kind of begin to kind of be thought of as relating to one another. So if we go back to my example before of a component with an index.js, a styles folder, and a utilities, we can see how over time, as it gets more and more complex and has a child component, we kind of get that nesting problem I was talking about before, where from a glance, you have to understand that you have to keep drilling down the child component. And let's say we had 4 or 5, we kind of get this blur where it's just 5, in one single folder, there's 5 different index.js's or 5 different styles and 5 different utilities. So under a system I was just talking about, we can maybe do something like, instead of doing component.js and then having all those different files for a child component, we could just have component.child component. So it could be header.profile-photo.js. And we can really try to tame a lot of that file sprawl that we've had before and a lot of that nesting, and really from a glance understand that component.js only has four files associated with it. And it's a little easier to navigate and understand as opposed to a bunch of different subfiles. And whether or not you kind of take this suggestion or this idea of adding a bunch of information, because I do understand it can get out of hand very quickly, I do think it's an important and interesting thought experiment around how do we use the structures that we already have, and how do we use something like a file name that we kind of maybe all take for granted and what is a future use that can be more informational and be more self-documenting. And the last concept I want to talk about is public hearings and comment periods. So this is a picture of an internal RFC document, and I will go more into what that is. So a public hearing and comment period, it's usually in the context of rulemaking committees and agendas, but it just basically allows the public time to submit feedback on an upcoming rule change. They allow feedback from your community, and it gives everyone a chance to communicate. And it also helps discover new insight and overlook details, because there's always going to be someone who understands the system or understands a part of the system better than you or better than a group of people, and is able to bring that unique perspective to say, hey, actually, like, when you think about that solution, we did that before, and this is something that we ran into. And it can help kind of make sure you aren't just repeating the mistakes of the past over and over again. And what I showed you before is, like I said, RFC, it's a request for comments. It's a document that we use heavily at the New York Times. It allows teams to solicit feedback and comments on their solutions. And they're kind of reviewed and maintained and moved through a process by our architecture review board, which is made up of engineers throughout the company that rotate on and off. The RFC itself is made up of the design and the implementation of your solution. And you can think of the design as why, where you really have to go into detail around the background, the context, the scope of the change, historically, why we haven't done this before, or what can we learn from the past, and the implementation being the how, so specific tools and frameworks and integrations of existing systems. There's a quote in it that says, RFCs help us ensure that our org is building the right things and building the things right. And I think that's really important, because RFCs share information. When you're working in a code base, you're working amongst code. There's always going to be more information than one single person can know. So by documenting what we know, it allows other people to kind of come in and add their own insight and really collaborate. It also surfaces hidden assumptions, because, like I said, there may be one part of your solution that overlooks something critical that a person closer to that knowledge domain might have better insight into, can help you overcome a hurdle that may come down the line. You also can learn from others' experiences, like I said, someone who has more domain knowledge. And you can find unknown stakeholders, because there have been times where decisions are going to be made that really affect you, and you may not know it. So RFCs are a good way to kind of broadcast that, hey, this is what this team is thinking of doing, and allows everyone to kind of build consensus and feel a part of the journey instead of just dictated at. And I think that even though we do this at an organizational standpoint, you can also do it in your code base and in any software tool. So I think another example of this is the React working group. So to help, they just announced this yesterday, but to help with the rollout of React 18, they created a working group, and it's a bunch of GitHub discussions where people from the community can ask questions, solicit feedback, and really just collaborate on the release. And I really like this model of software engineering, because it's the acknowledgement that React is an island. It is used by all of us, and that we need to ensure that the community is going along with us, and that the community feels as though they are part of this journey and not just being dictated at. So I would highly recommend that if you're interested in React 18, that you check this out and see if there's anything that makes you pause or have any questions. And I'm a part of this working group, so you can find me on Twitter and reach out if you have any questions, and I'll do my best to get you as many answers as I can. So when we revisit our takeaways again, I think code bases are very much like cities. Maps and signs help teams navigate a code base. Desire paths create fresh ways to navigate a code base. and comment periods create engagement and share ideas. And I really think the overall theme here is that cities are a great metaphor because cities evolve over time. They constantly need to change to meet people's needs, and they're not static. Things pop up and technology advances, and I don't think that L'Enfant, when he originally designed DC, could even fathom what a car was. But here we are for traffic circle that is horrible to go through. And I think that even though L'Enfant had this grand plan, like I said, cities change and they evolve. And we don't have to be tied to our decisions or our mistakes or one person's grand plan. And I think the beautiful thing is that if a city can change, so can our code base. So earlier this year, DC acquired the land here through eminent domain. Eminent domain is a process here in the States where the government can come and purchase a piece of land from the owner and kind of reuse it and repurpose it for the better use for the public. And we've started to kind of reimagine what this new place could be. Instead of it being a roundabout, what is a way that makes it easier for people to navigate, that causes less traffic, causes less accidents, but also what if it was a green space and create a space for people to relax and kind of find community with one another. And I think it's really beautiful because when you think about our code bases, the reason that they become legacy software is that we stop investing in them. And we stop changing them, and they stop changing over time. And there are rare cases where you need to start over, but I like to use this example because it's a thought experiment. And what if our code bases also changed over time with us? What if we continued to invest in our code and over time changed it to meet different needs and different use cases? And what if our code bases were a little more like cities? Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Mello. It was actually really nice. And thanks for the, let's say, insight or way of thinking, sharing that actually was, I think many of the guys will find it extremely helpful. So props to you. Thank you very much. Yeah. It was really nice. I enjoyed it a lot. Awesome. So I can't say more. I only want to say once more to the guys watching that you can go through the Auth0 challenge that is running throughout the day. Make sure you try to make that work, make the login work that the challenge is suggesting, and you can go and get basically for a chance to get a pair of headphones from Auth0. Also check out the rest of the sponsors. I want to thank again Mello for the awesome talk and for taking the time to get this all filled in. And for the rest of you guys, I guess we'll sync in about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for our next talk. So see you there. Mello, I hope you have a great day. I know it's morning there. So yeah, have a great day. It's getting later here in the afternoon. But wish you a great day. And thanks again for the talk. Everyone is waving, saying bye and thank you in the chat, just letting you know. So yeah, we'll sync her again with all of you guys in about 20 minutes.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Have a good one.